I know exactly. We never know which is the right way to do it.
Elbow, face.
You get the shoulder tap.
Good morning.
Great. So
Right now.
Live already. Good. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, we're all live, so get yourself set up, and we'll begin. Okay, Marco, Eva, the floor is yours, so go ahead. We've got a couple members of the press right here, but also letting you know there are people online who will be also asking questions, and I'll channel them through the YouTube channel. The floor is yours, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David, and thank you for your interest, to you in the room and those online. My name is Eva Zabey. I'm the Executive Director of Business for Nature, and I'm here with Marco.
My name is Marco Lambertini. I am the Director General of WWF International.
And we're really here to talk about the importance of a strong mission in the Global Biodiversity Framework towards being a nature positive by 2030, which essentially means that we would need to have more nature in 2030 than we have in 2020. So to kick off, Marco, would you like to start?
Thank you very much, Eva. So first of all, let me just underscore the gravity of the situation. I think there is a clear evidence, overwhelming evidence, that nature loss, biodiversity loss, is beginning to be so grave that is leading entire ecosystems towards tipping point. Science has never been clearer about this. The awareness of this impact has never been greater. But something even more important perhaps has happened, which is not just the understanding of the impact that we are having on the planet, but the understanding of the impact that this is having on our own lives and on our future. And so, as we often say, nature conservation used to be primarily an ethical concern. Today, towards the coexistence with the rest of life on Earth, today actually nature conservation, or rather nature loss, it is an economic issue. It is a social issue. It is an issue about human health, as we painfully learned from the experience of the pandemic. And also it is a justice issue. It is an issue related to the fact that vulnerable communities are going to be on the receiving end much harder than other communities at the end of biodiversity loss and climate change. And also intergenerational justice issue, because we are living significantly dangerous problems to our kids and their children. So in this kind of cultural shift in the way we perceive nature conservation and nature loss as a major societal problem, we are advocating for these particular negotiations that are happening today to send a very strong signal to the world, to the markets, to consumers, and embrace a global goal for nature, as we have embraced in Paris for climate. On climate, we have a very clear direction. The whole world is now focusing on achieving a carbon neutral goal by 2050. That means net zero emissions by 2050. And similarly, we want the world to embrace a nature positive global goal for nature by 2030. As Eva said, that basically means more nature by the end of the decade than we have today. More forests on the planet, more pollinators in our countryside, more fish in the ocean and in the rivers, more biodiversity worldwide. And just the examples I made, fish, pollinators, forest, trees, make a direct link to the contributions that nature is providing to us, and in future will continue if we take care of nature sustainably. And this global goal will have the great power to send a clear signal to the whole of society, to align the actions of governments, of businesses, of consumers, in order to contribute and to move all towards contributing to a common global goal. That's happening for climate, although we all know it's not fast enough and we need to accelerate our actions on climate change for sure, but at least everybody is focused on a common direction and a common goal. We need to make that happen for nature as well. Without that global goal, without a strong mission, quantifiable, measurable in the global biodiversity framework, everything else will be ineffective, because we will never know whether the targets and the goals under the global biodiversity work framework will actually be able to deliver that nature positive future. A future where we stop losing nature, we start restoring nature, and we're going to replenish the empty ecosystems, and we're going to increase the health of critical earth systems that are so fundamental to the balance of the planet, and as a consequence to the stability and prosperity of our society. So that's our call. We are united. Eva and I are just here representing a much larger group of organizations, environmental, sustainable development, civil society more broadly, indigenous people, women rights, organizations that actually are embracing this call. Many governments are also supporting a nature positive, ambitious global goal for nature. And Eva is now talking about how the business is perceiving such a global direction. So Eva, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Marco. From the business perspective, companies really need the mission of knowing what this global goal is that everyone should be rallying around and what contribution they can make towards a united goal. Just taking a step back, companies, hundreds if not thousands of companies are already making commitments and taking action. But if we're honest about it, we know it's not enough. We need to quickly scale and speed up that business action. And we've also learned from the climate discussions that one of the fastest and most powerful levers for change is going to be policy ambition, which in turn will drive even more business action on the ground. And that's why the Global Biodiversity Framework is so critical. It's such a big opportunity for us to be the Paris Climate Agreement equivalent for nature. And as part of that, companies need to understand what is the global mission that we're all working towards by 2030. And the nature positive concept and mission, having more nature in 2030 than we have in 2020, becomes more tangible, something that companies can know that they, in their own actions, through their value chains, need to contribute towards. So in the Global Biodiversity Framework, Business for Nature, as a coalition of leading business organizations, as well as some leading conservation organizations that work with businesses, is really calling for, in this meetings in Geneva, we need the strong mission that we've just been talking about. We also need to strengthen Target 15, which is about business action, and Target 18, which is about environmentally harmful subsidies. So very briefly on Target 15, on the business action, companies need that direction from governments to assess and disclose both their impacts but also their dependencies on nature, disclose these so that ultimately we're getting the right information from companies so investors can make better informed decisions, so that regulators and capital markets can recognize performance beyond only financial performance, but taking into account environmental and social performance as well. And this needs to move towards a mandatory disclosure, mandatory decision-making and disclosure. Of course, for many companies, especially small and medium-sized enterprise, that means it needs to be accompanied by a supporting mechanism with capacity building and additional resources to make that possible. On Target 18, which is very much about the shifting environmentally harmful subsidies, new research from February shows that $1.8 trillion every year are being directed to subsidies that are environmentally harmful. This is unintended, I should say, but these are massive financial flows that could be redirected to help close the biodiversity financing gap, which is over $700 billion a year, into more sustainable and nature-positive actions. Again, these are all triggers that will influence the way businesses operate. So going back to the mission and the nature positive, giving this sets the direction, gives a sense of the urgency to companies, and make sure that it gives the companies the political certainty to quickly invest, innovate, and shift their business models. So we're very much supportive of this concept. Companies already are working on what it would mean for their businesses and supply chains. But once again, the individual projects and cases are not cutting it in order to address the scale of the urgency that Marco articulated at the beginning, that nature is at a tipping point.
If I may add one additional input, just building on what you just said, Eva, is that if you look at the carbon neutral global goal on climate and net zero emissions by 2050, that goal has been able to disrupt the energy sector, beginning to move investment towards renewable energy, pushing for regulation, carbon markets, and so on and so forth. We need to see the same for the other economic sectors that are driving nature loss. We need to disrupt the food systems, agriculture as well as fishing. We need to disrupt the infrastructure system. We need to disrupt forestry, structures, so that we are going to lead our economy towards having in nature positive and carbon neutral agriculture, in nature positive and carbon neutral infrastructure sector, and so on and so forth. And that will be the system change that we need to see. With the redirection of the financial flows that I was referring to, we know that that's possible. It's not impossible. It's actually possible, and let me say, it's also necessary, because the cost that we're going to pay if we don't take action in order to reverse nature loss are going to be immense, particularly because now we understand that the nexus climate and nature is so strong. And COP26 in Glasgow, as well as the latest IPCC report, are making it extremely clear that unless we maintain the carbon storage today in nature, forest, wetlands, marine ecosystems, and many other habitats in the world, we won't be able to achieve to limit global warming below 1.5. So that's another element. Climate and nature now are part of the same opportunity, the opportunity to build a safe future for us and for all life on Earth.
I have a question. I'm Fred Sabelkus of German weekly Die Zeit. As opposed to you talk about the comparison between climate and biodiversity, and I think maybe we can talk about this. One major difference that is very obvious is the question of the indicator, and how do you measure success in that part. While you have in climate realm, you have obvious CO2 equivalents, and for biodiversity is obviously much more complex because it's a more systematic approach. So I wonder if you have some suggestions about the type of indicators we can talk about to measure whether a company, a business is nature positive or not.
Thank you very much. This is a key element to the whole discussion and a key question. Thank you very much for the question. So first of all, I will point out, I will send you a link to a paper that we actually, another 14 organization has subscribed to recently about measuring nature positive, what that means and how you actually measure it. But we're still, and we need to be honest about it, there's still a discussion about the ultimate meta-metric, if you like, which is the CO2 equivalent in the climate sphere. If you ask climate scientists, they're going to tell you that actually measuring climate change is a complex business as well. It's not as simple as it looks. But clearly, they've been able to identify the outcome metric in CO2 equivalent levels in the atmosphere. If you want to really simply, the discussion is still ongoing, and we hope that during these couple of weeks we'll make progress on that as well. But if you want to look at perhaps meta-metrics similar to that of climate for biodiversity, extent of natural habitat, extent and integrity of natural habitats probably is the one. The IPCC latest report has actually highlighted very clearly that we need, as part of the overall strategy to limit global warming below 1.5, we need to secure the natural state of what's left on the planet in the natural state. So we need to secure effectively the natural state of almost half of the planet as it is today. Of course, that doesn't mean that you don't sustainably utilize these habitats, but they need to be utilized in a way that maintain the ecological health of these places. So a natural area-based overall metric, let's say a net positive area-based global goal, meaning protect what we've got and restore what we can restore, could be the overall metric that ends in hands with the CO2 emissions, equivalent emissions, could be the biodiversity indicator. That will lead then to a commitment of net zero, or net positive net zero conversion overall, and on top of that, a restoration effort that would then deliver the nature positive goal, which is halt the loss and begin to restore so that we have more nature, more natural spaces and ecosystems on the world than today. And that's necessary because we have lost so much in the last several decades that stopping the loss is just not enough. That's why today in our joint statement we made very clear that the current mission of CBD, Global Biodiversity Framework, it's inadequate. It's not ambitious enough. It's not science-based enough. We need to inject that ambition of halting and restoring a nature positive goal. And the global measurement of area-based protection and sustainable use could be the equivalent to the one we have for climate. It's still an ongoing discussion, because in these situations, as you know very well, also from the climate debate, sometimes we are a victim of trying to identify the perfect indicator that captures everything, and by doing that, we lose the communicability, the simplicity that is needed to really drive ambition and cohesion. And so we need to get to the point very soon before, in fact, the final COP15.
I just wanted to add, because it's an absolutely spot-on question. Also, the difference, of course, is local impacts versus global impacts. But with all of these, I think we all have to get more comfortable with the complexity of what we're talking about as well. And we can't be paralyzed by the complexity. If the question is, but because also as part of that, when you go the next level down, we cannot afford to have unintended consequences of trade-offs taking place between different ecosystems and species. That is not the idea. That we need to make sure that we're protecting, restoring, and sustainably using natural resources that we have. And going back to the Global Biodiversity Framework, there's an opportunity there in the fact that the Mission 2030 in its current wording is vague. And so nature positive by 2030 is not perfect either, but it is the next step of giving that direction of travel, looking at species, ecosystems, and natural processes. And all of those indicators exist within the draft monitoring framework that is being discussed. And it's a matter of understanding overall on that dashboard, what does that mean for the planet? And that's something that everyone can rally around. So just to complement Marco's answer.
I mean, I have more questions.
Keep going, go ahead.
So could you maybe, to make it a bit more practical, could we talk about an example? I just was thinking, for instance, about the company Microsoft, which has very strong commitment on becoming nature positive. And they are talking about the direct impacts they have with their factories in their supply chain, but then also they're thinking about what is happening on the consumer side and how, like in the whole life cycle of the product they're developing. And I wonder if you could share some examples of actually businesses that are doing something already and where we stand.
No, happy to. I think the reality currently is that no one company has all the answers, just so you know. Everyone is figuring out exactly how as a company they can contribute to a nature positive world. But all companies, to begin with, must assess their impacts and dependencies, because it's across the value chain. Where are your most material impacts and dependencies? What are the most relevant commitments that you can make that are based on science? And now we have the Science-Based Targets Network that is coming out with methodologies for companies to use. Then how can they act to not only reduce their negative impacts, but then go towards restoring and providing a positive contribution on nature? And then it's also about transforming and changing the rules of the game that they operate in, because of course the incentives and the penalties need to be put in place that incentivize the right behavior as opposed to doing the opposite of actually encouraging nature negative, if you want, actions. So as an example, so some companies, like you mentioned, Microsoft, are taking really ambitious steps in terms of the vision, which is where the power of nature positive comes in. Similarly, GSK or other companies are looking at that. What I think is helpful is to look at a pragmatic, in a way, an important, smaller example, but that shows how you can go towards becoming nature positive. And that is the company Natura & Co., which is a Brazilian cosmetics company that includes the Body Shop, Avon, Aesop, and Natura itself. And in the Amazon, so Natura & Co. have a commitment of zero deforestation in the Amazon by 2025. And one of the ways they're concretely working on this are with indigenous communities in the Amazon. And they're making it an economically strong case. So one of the trees, the Akuba tree in the Amazon, is normally used, typically cut down and used for fiber, wood. But what Natura & Co. realized is that the seeds of the Akuba tree provide hugely beneficial moisturizing properties and can be used in their products. And so they pay the local communities 3 times more to keep the tree standing and to be able to harvest the seeds than cutting it down. One consequence of that for the company is they need to shift their business timelines, because of course, instead of nature having to fit into a business quarterly timeline, it's the other way around. So sometimes the company has to say to the clients, to the customers, I'm afraid we don't have your product because it isn't available in nature. And that's very interesting because the response from the clients have been very positive because they understand the natural cycle. So increasingly, if more of those examples come into play, that will add up to essentially, as part of your economic imperative, you are protecting and restoring nature, which is good for the planet, good for people, and good for business.
To your question, just to add again to what Eva just said, effectively, even when in Paris we agreed on the carbon neutrality kind of direction, most companies had no idea how to become carbon neutral. So what we need is embracing a vision that is science-based and we know is what we need to do. Once you embrace the vision, then comes the second phase. The second phase is for each company, each sector, and each company to actually audit their footprint vis-a-vis that global goal. And that's why companies are welcoming a nature positive global goal, like carbon neutral global goal, because that gives them a reference point against which they can then develop their footprint audit and a mitigation plan accordingly. So by adopting the global goal for nature, we're just beginning, we're going to start the process of then identifying science-based targets for nature, as much as we are identifying science-based targets for climate right now for companies, that will deliver the global goal of nature positive. And so some companies will have a more direct impact that can be more easily mitigated. Others will have much more indirect impact through supply chains that will have to be analyzed and discussed and addressed. So, but back to our earlier point, unless we have that global goal clearly codified in GBF, we're pretty sure that companies will be unable to reduce their footprint in line with what's necessary and with what science is asking us to do, which is halt and reverse by 2030, nature positive. So there is a process of auditing and developing mitigation plans that will follow. And CBD-GBF, the Global Biodiversity Framework, is critical in sending the signal to the markets, to the companies, to consumers, to governments, to this critical step for us. But of course, it's a tricky one, because as I said earlier, if you approve and agree to a nature positive global goal, that means we're not going to tweak the edges of the system. We have to address the system change head on, and that's scary. And that's why so far there is a lot of support for a nature positive global goal, but there's also a lot of opposition from obvious interest groups, exactly like there was opposition to carbon neutral for climate 10 years ago.
Where would you say that the most pressure comes from on companies? Is it actually because we're talking about the company that you mentioned, the Brazilian cosmetic company, where you have pressure from the consumer? But also you both mentioned it twice that it's important to have like a policy framework in order so companies have a system in which they can operate. So I wonder what drivers and where does the pressure come from?
I think that there are a number of pressure points, whether it's reputational, but most importantly operational, is that the actual natural resources that companies depend on, and we see when supply chains are blocked, the importance of realizing how companies completely depend on nature for their business to operate. But then there's also the financial risks and opportunities where investors are starting to ask, like one example, BNP Paribas asset managers ask for companies to disclose their natural capital risks and opportunities, and that is part of their assessment of whether or not they'll get beneficial benefits or not. And similarly, the task force on nature-related financial disclosures that you may have heard is trying to standardize some of that work. So I think the financial side is going to become even more important. But once again, altogether, it's still not enough, because if the pressure and the incentives and the penalties were enough and efficient, we wouldn't be having this conversation, and we wouldn't need to ask the Global Biodiversity Framework to be even stronger, because the markets would be regulating themselves with the information they have. And unfortunately, the risk of nature loss is not accounted for, and sufficiently to make that the default choice. What you would want is the default would be to be investing in nature, because it would be the one that makes the most business sense. But unfortunately, that's not currently the case. So that's why the political landscape needs to help give this additional push. And as soon as that happens, the whole system reacts to that and starts to then expect and call on companies, financial, but also governments themselves to be held accountable for their impacts and dependencies.
But that seems to bring us back to the question of the metrics again, right? Because in a way, how do you incorporate these metrics into your business case?
But I think,
exactly?
As Eva said, the three buckets of key metrics that could actually help each company to identify their footprint and address it are species, impact on species, impact on species, populations, for example, agriculture, on species deforestation, on species fishing directly, and natural processes, because they are essential to maintain the earth systems that biodiversity is part of. So those are the kind of metrics that can be easily used by each company to measure their impact.
But I would say, sorry, from a business perspective, there are methodologies that companies use, and there are frameworks out there like the Natural Capital Protocol that is a framework for companies to measure and value their impact and dependency on nature. There are tools, whether it's the Global Biodiversity Footprint or other methodologies, but what is needed is to standardize that, to become to enable companies to compete on performance and not on methodology. Currently, there's such a suite of different methodologies that you can't, that's not standardized and you can't compare. But you're absolutely right, and in the next phase of the Global Biodiversity Framework development, all of the monitoring frameworks will be developed, and essentially what we're saying is that a number of those elements in the indicators that are agreed by countries can add up to give us a sense of if we're on track or not towards the higher level mission.
Any other questions? Go ahead.
Sorry, I came into this a little bit late. Emma Farge from Reuters. I'm interested in what my colleague said about like the pressure from companies. I was wondering, here in Geneva, are you seeing any sort of organized lobbying against any of the targets? Maybe not here physically, but virtually. as these discussions take place? And if so, could you talk us through a little bit about what you're seeing?
Well, actually, I see a very positive story here, is that for the first time at this final negotiation meeting of the CBD, we've never seen as many companies come to Geneva. Business for Nature is a coalition of business organizations, has brought together, there are more than 35 companies here in Geneva. Many of them don't have access to the actual venue, but they want to be here to engage and to call for a more progressive global biodiversity framework. So it's actually the way of saying Target 15, for example, on business action is a very welcomed. We strongly appreciate the addition. It's already having an impact in terms of demonstrating to businesses that they need to be part of the solution, and they, even though the global biodiversity framework is the responsibility for governments, the only way it can be successful is a whole of society approach, and businesses is going to be a key actor in helping that transformation happen. So I would say we're very much looking forward to having conversations with parties, and businesses are coming with us. So in the opening plenary just earlier today, on behalf of the Business for Nature Coalition and Finance for Biodiversity, in fact, there was a business representative speaking to all of the parties, very happy to communicate our key messaging. So around the mission of being nature positive by 2030, making sure the mission in the framework is very strong, because that will give political certainty to businesses. And then the Target 15 that needs to be further strengthened to include mandatory assessment and disclosure of business impacts and dependencies. And then finally on Target 18 on the environmental harmful subsidies, that once again needs to reflect the new research on the $1.8 trillion a year that's going towards, unintentionally, towards environmentally harmful subsidies instead of the opposite. So there are some really strong messages coming from the business community, from all sectors, all sizes, all geographies, that are essentially saying, just like ahead of the Paris Agreement, as companies, we know that we need to level the playing field so that we can compete not only on our financial performance as it is today, and that there's a whole transformation of the systems that we depend on and are part of. So a very positive message actually coming from the businesses here in Geneva.
Including the agricultural industry that benefits from the $1.8 trillion?
In fact, well, no, yes, a number of the companies that are part of those sectors that would be the equivalent of the hard-to-abate sectors in the climate discussions. There's a recognition that the transformation is going to happen, needs to happen fast, and therefore we need a process for it to happen. And so companies that want to be successful in the long term understand that and want to be part of that transition.
Just to add to your question, because I think it's super important, there are really 5 key sectors which are the big 5 that are unfortunately accounting for the majority of the impact on nature. Food systems is the first, agriculture and fishing. So when you talk about food systems, let's not forget the fishing industry, both in the ocean and in fresh waters. Infrastructure, forestry, and extractives. Actually, the food companies are the ones that have started the conversation about nature positive, for example, commitment on zero deforestation in supply chains earlier than others, because they are the ones that are driving the biggest impact. They have been driving the biggest impact so far. And the commitments that we hear about deforestation around supply chains are quite impressive. Now, the implementation of those are quite complex, and so we're working through with the companies and with governments, because we need the government role as well is super important, how to actually make those commitments translate into reality. But I would say that the food sector on conversion, zero deforestation, there is strong commitment because the consumers are really pushing very hard for that. When it becomes more tricky is the impact of the food sector, particularly agriculture, mainly agriculture, in terms of pesticides and nutrients and herbicides and fertilizers. That's where there is still quite a bit of tension, to be honest, and where I think there's still a discussion to be happening, because I think we're not there yet. And the impact this is having on pollinators and eutrophication of rivers and lakes and coastal waters is a massive impact that has been not spoken a lot about until now, but it's definitely firmly one of the things that we need to address.
Mhm.
No more for now? Okay, great. Okay, well, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. We'll see you over the course of the week, and you'll have representatives of the media here. Very good. Thanks so
Thank
much.
you
Thank
so
you for
much.
representing us.
Thank you.
Thank you for your questions.